Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of ClearHead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Life is full of ups and downs, and it can be easy to let the bad things that are happening to you result in negative emotions taking over how you feel on a daily basis. Have you ever felt out of control with your anger, or have very intrusive thoughts? Or have you been thinking about how you can better regulate your emotions? This is the episode for you. Our guest today is Dr. Cristian Conte, who will share with us the simple techniques behind anger management to help you calmly cope with the trials of everyday life, which can make a world of difference in your well-being. Dr. Cristian Conte is a world-renowned Level 5 anger management expert, a licensed professional counselor, and author of dozens of books. From working with celebrities to Hall of Fame athletes, from elite military personnel to people on death row and everyone in between, Dr. Conte has spent over 25 years helping people deal with their anger. Although Dr. Conte specializes in working with some of the most dangerous individuals on the planet, his passion now is in training others to communicate effectively, regardless of the intensity of the situation, helping you speak in ways that can overcome other people's ego and defensiveness in order to be heard. Welcome, Cristian.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, to kick us off, maybe you could get us started with, how did you get into this field of anger management?
Well, when I was a teenager, I remember asking my dad, who was an earth scientist, why he studied, I said, why do you study earth science? Like, what do you like about rocks? And my dad said, well, if you're only ever going to live on one planet your entire life, don't you think you ought to get to know that planet? And that answer stuck with me. And then when I was in college and young and trying to think about what I would want to study, his advice kind of echoed through me, except I kind of morphed it a little bit. And I thought, if I'm only ever going to live with me my entire life, wouldn't I ought to want to get to know myself? And so I just started to passionately pursue psychology in all areas as a general practitioner, for sure. I'm 6 feet, 260-pound bald guy with a beard and tattoos. So people say I don't tend to look like the typical therapist. So I've been able to do some undercover work. And what I realized was when people are struggling with intense anger, it's such an awful feeling, and you feel so out of control. And I think I just try to take a really hands-on, down-to-earth approach to help people understand. Look, my tagline is there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who have issues and dead people. So if you're alive, you have issues. So do I. We all do. And I just try to help people make the best possible choices that they can.
I love that you started from such a personal journey to understand yourself and then learn techniques that you can then help others to understand themselves. Well, maybe let's go back to basic. What is anger management?
Okay, so a lot of people, well, I've heard this before. Oh, level 5 anger management specialist, you must not get angry. To the contrary, it's not that I don't get angry. It's not that all people don't experience anger. Anger in itself is not wrong or bad. Anger can be a wonderful motivator. Anger can help you get out of a difficult or toxic situation. Anger is an emotion. It's a signal. It teaches us something. Anger management is key because here's the piece where it can get out of control. When anger starts to control you rather than you listening and learning from anger, well, then it's probably time to learn how to manage it. And that to me is the essence of what anger management is. It's not about trying to never feel angry. It's about understanding how do you really deal with it when that intense emotion hits.
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind, stuff like the Hulk or Jekyll and Hyde, where this persona just takes over. And as you said, the anger controls the individual rather than the other way around. Do you think that most people who experience this is even aware that the anger is controlling them and that they've lost control?
That's a great question. I also really like the highlighting of the Incredible Hulk, because sometimes people have a tendency to believe that that's the picture of anger. And if I don't have that kind of anger, then I must not really have an issue with it. But anger doesn't have to be the green Hulk smashing everything. Anger can sometimes be put out in passive aggressiveness. So you can still deal with intense anger even if you're not throwing things around. And I do have a guide to help people recognize whether or not their anger is an issue. Men would come to my anger management groups and they'd say, how do I really know I have a problem, doc? And I'd say, listen, if one person told you had a problem with anger one time in the middle of an argument, you probably don't have an issue with anger. But if one person told you multiple times, or more tellingly, if multiple people have told you have an issue with anger, then you have an issue and you just can't see it. Because here's one of the great truisms of life. People see your actions, not your intentions. So it never matters what you meant to be or didn't mean to be in life. It only ever matters what you actually do. Now, we judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge other people by their actions. And so let me just dive in a little bit further, and that is this. We have a tendency to minimize the harm we cause others and amplify or highlight the harm they cause us. So if you're driving down the road and you cut someone off in traffic and they get mad, there's a tendency to say, oh, what's the big deal? I just made a little mistake. Chill out. But if they cut you off, oh my goodness, what a jerk. I can't believe it. And so it's a big deal if they do it. It's not a big deal if you do it. So when it comes to personal growth, being able to have awareness, how anger impacts you is huge, because it impacts all of us on some level.
That's interesting, I guess, in the context that, as you said, part of how you get people to evaluate whether they have an anger issue or not is if someone tells them that they've got an anger issue. But I also know that for a lot of people, this is a very hard thing, especially if they really do become like the Hulk and they get physically abusive. People either don't say anything or they slowly try and inch out of your life, and you actually never get that feedback loop. So what happens in that context? So imagine someone does have an anger issue. Nobody is brave enough to give them that feedback because maybe they fear the consequences. Or maybe it's their boss, like their boss could fire them if they tell their boss they've got an anger issue. How do you kind of then reconcile that self reflection or self-awareness piece in that context?
I love that question. I love that direction. So you're absolutely right. It's not just if people tell you, because look, we fight wars in our minds. We deal with incredible intensity of emotions in our minds, and no one ever knows about it. So absolutely someone can deal with anger and not know. So a guideline I have for people is this. In your own internal world, and you're the only one who knows the answer to this, because in the history of humanity, you are the only person who has unrestricted access to your mind. So you and you alone know what's really going on inside. But here's my guide for people if they're wondering, if they're struggling with it. If the majority of your thoughts are focused on what other people should be doing differently, how other people should be thinking, feeling, believing, or behaving differently, then you're probably struggling intensely with, it's almost like reality slipping from you, because you think, well, I'd be fine if there weren't stupid people or something like that. In other words, everyone should be the way you think they should be. But that is just not reality. Reality is the world is the way it is. So I kind of break it down in this way. I say, just the way I told you, there are two kinds of people. I say there are two worlds that we live in. The first world is what I call the cartoon world, and that is our world of shoulds. People should think, feel, believe, and behave the way I think they should. And that could be logical, that can be rational. Unfortunately, it's not reality, because then there's the real world, how people actually think, feel, believe, and behave. And as long as you align your expectations with this imaginary, fictitious cartoon world, you're going to be let down when you run into the reality and it's not what you think it should be. And so I've spent the majority of my career teaching people how to align their expectations with reality. So coming back to your question, how does somebody know that you're struggling? The more time you spend in what I would call your cartoon world, the more angst you have inside. And a lot of times we deal with that angst through anger. And listen, it can get complex, but I think I really respect your show and the direction. So I don't mind talking about it a little more in depth if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go there.
So what happens is this. There are levels of consciousness or levels of awareness. And the lowest level of awareness or lowest level of consciousness is what's called shame. So there's a difference between shame and guilt, by the way. Guilt is feeling bad about something that you've done. There's nothing wrong with that. If you hurt someone and you feel bad, that's kind of a good thing. Learn from it and grow. Shame, however, so whereas guilt is feeling bad about something you've done, shame is feeling bad about who you are. And my research, more than 25 years, has shown me that shame is not healthy. It doesn't do us much good at all. In fact, people who live in shame act out of shame. So if I think I'm no good or not worthy, then why not hurt myself? Why not hurt others? So I really spend a lot of time trying to help people not live in shame and instead grow from, we all make mistakes. Okay, so the lowest level is shame. Above shame is depression. Anyone who's ever struggled with depression knows it's an awful feeling. It can be, you can feel almost immobile, like there's nothing you can do from it. Above depression is anxiety. And again, if anyone's ever struggled with anxiety, it's just an awful feeling you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, because anxiety, we're flooded with all this excess of cortisol, adrenaline. So we have shame, depression, and anxiety. Now here's the key. Above those three is anger, which means we would rather be angry than stuck in shame, depression, or anxiety. And so a lot of times people don't understand why they're so angry, but sometimes they're caught up in what I call the cycle of shame, where you feel so bad about who you are, and then you're so stuck in that, and it feels so awful that then you lash out in anger. And whether you lash out at others in anger, which happens, that's probably the Hulk metaphor, or you have battles in your mind and arguments in your mind. I call them shower arguments. So imagine you're in the shower and you're arguing with someone in your mind, and you even feel like you beat them. Like, I told them. And by the time you get out of the shower and look yourself in the mirror, you realize you weren't talking to anybody but yourself. So of course you're going to win that argument because you knew every counter argument. It's like playing chess with yourself. Of course you're going to win, but you're also going to lose too. But those shower arguments where people argue with themselves and argue with others, they're really arguing with themselves, and they give false confidence because people start to believe they really figured out the other person when in fact they were the one that set up the softball answer that they refuted. But those type of arguments occur where people spend so much time arguing with what they think is others in their mind. And that's the unrest that occurs. And it very well may have to do with shame, depression, or anxiety. And you know this as a medical doctor, when we're stuck in anxiety and we have that cortisol, excess cortisol, and it feels awful. But when we lash out in anger, even in our minds, we are flooded with endorphins. And so that physically feels better, at least temporarily, until we say, oh, I can't believe I did this, or whatever our mental picture of ourselves is. And so that's one of the reasons why we unconsciously continue to dwell in anger without realizing it, because we're stuck in that pattern.
I love how you actually went deep on that, because actually what you're saying is the anger is simply a reaction to an underlying issue that we haven't worked through, whether we're conscious or unconscious about it. And a lot of that comes back to the root of what are you ashamed about? Is it about yourself? Is it about your situation? And instead of feeling shame and depression and anxiety because it doesn't feel good, anger at least feels like something that gives us temporary relief from this state of unease that we're in. So I think that's such a beautiful way of actually helping people kind of look at anger beyond just anger as an emotion.
And it's powerful, and it's worth noting that anger is obviously not the highest form of consciousness. So love and knowledge, compassion, all those wonderful things are way above that. I'm just looking about those lowest four where it's down at the bottom there. So by no means, and the reason why I share that is, if you were to gain awareness and have compassion for yourself or others, you can rise above that shame, depression, and anxiety without having to go through anger by any means whatsoever. But if I could work out a math problem, I'm not a mathematician at all, but I would say if there was a formula for anger, it would be this: the degree to which you believe something should be, in other words, your cartoon world, the degree to which you believe something should be divided by how much it's actually not happening. I think that's where we could get a mathematical number for how angry a person gets.
Yeah. And also I think often that could also be used to frame, disappointment. You might get the promotion that you've been wanting. And then as part of the promotion, you got a pay rise. But in your head, the pay rise had to be $20,000. And instead, you got a $10,000 pay rise. And suddenly, the whole fact that you got a promotion, you got a $10,000 pay rise is tinged in disappointment because it was not your expected $20,000.
That's absolutely it. And I feel like that is one of the most powerful realizations people could have. I would say at this point in my life, if there's one concept that if I could have a magic wand and reach into people's hearts and have them truly understand, it would be the cartoon world. Because when you realize, it's you're exactly a great example you just gave. Well, it should have been a bigger raise, and I should have been noticed more for this and whatever. And again, I didn't create the idea of the shoulds. Karen Horney, she was neo-Freudian, and she wrote in Neurosis and Human Growth that the tyranny of the should. So in other words, should is this tyrant. Albert Ellis said don't should all over yourself. I just phrase it as what I call the cartoon world, because to me, it's as fictitious. It's just not reality as much as a cartoon's not reality.
And so let's just to kind of close off this part of the conversation. As you said, individuals who are experiencing anger is because there is a mismatch between how the world should be in their imagination versus how it actually is. What is the first step to helping them bridge the gap?
Well, so the first step is awareness, recognizing that that's what's going on. But so I work in a world of violence and I specialize in violence, and I work with people who do really horrific things to others. In the world that I'm in, when we're talking about real world potential violence or real world actual violence, I have to come up with solutions. So it can't just be awareness. Awareness is not enough. We have to say, okay, great, I have this. And I think if we break it down the way we did, people tend to understand that fairly quickly. So now the next step is this. And I've made my entire career, I've worked really hard at making things super simple for people, because I don't think life is that complex. I just think it takes a ton of effort to actually do. So the action step, I would say, is this. The more extreme words we use, the more extreme emotions we have. So think about that should world. So if we were to say things like, nobody listens to me, everybody hates me. Well, there are over 8 billion people on planet Earth. So if genuinely nobody listens to you, you're in a tough way. But if we, instead of taking this exaggerated view of life what I teach is to help people have accurate language. The more accurate your language, the more balanced your emotions. The more extreme your language, the more extreme your emotions. So that's the next practical step. The first one is awareness, wonderful, beautiful. But right after you get that awareness, now what do? Well, we begin to implement accurate language.
I love that. And actually, it's something that is so doable for everyone, just to take the time to kind of evaluate how am I communicating with myself when I have those shower thoughts, and how am I communicating with others? And that can really reflect how our experience can be. And also, it sort of triggers this quote for me by Stephen Covey. We judge ourselves by our intention and others by their behavior. And so instead of just getting angry immediately by someone's behavior, how can we take a step back and say compassionately, okay, maybe that person that just cut me off is trying to get his wife in time to the hospital because they had a birth that is going to happen any minute now. How can we be compassionate about why someone is acting that way? And instead of assuming the worst, kind of try and be compassionate about maybe that person's really struggling at the moment.
That's not something to even gloss over. So to me, again, it might be a simple concept to understand, but it is deeply profound for people to actually practice. As a matter of fact, I believe the new wave of the world is going to be this. Human beings with AI and everything else we have with technology are going to have access to more information, more knowledge than any time before in the history of humanity. The difference where people will truly separate themselves as experts in self-mastery will be those who actually practice the wisdom that they can access so easily. And so to be able to genuinely practice understanding this concept of extreme language or accurate language, it really is where the rubber meets the road. So this simple concept is the basis, what you were getting at right there with that example of the car and someone cuts you off and you don't know. So I developed something called yield theory, which is now an evidence-based approach to communication. I developed back in 1998. I've spent my whole career working on it, articulating it. It comes down to 3 core actions, 7 fundamental components. But essentially, it is based on this fundamental assumption, and that is that if I lived every day as another person, so I'm not just talking about walking a metaphorical mile in their shoes, which is wonderful and beautiful, but what I'm saying is if I lived as that person, in other words, I had that person's cognitive functioning, I had that person's affective range, ability to experience emotions, and their life experiences, how can I say that I would have ever done anything differently from what that person did? And that it's just a thought exercise. So it's easy for people to say, oh, well, I wouldn't have done that. I had a tough life. Yeah, but you had your life. You had your intelligence. I know from my own work with twins, triplets, that people live vastly different experiences in the same home with the same genetic makeup. So people's view can shift ever so slightly and can be a world of difference. So taking the time to understand you don't know what's going on in someone else's life. Now, here's where people tend to flip. The fancy Jungian term for it is called enantiodromia, which is where we go from one extreme to the other. So people will say, well, if I'm supposed to understand what's going on, you're saying I should just accept whatever people do. And I'm not saying that at all, because there's a big difference between understanding and excusing behavior. I've always said my job is to explain human behavior. My job is not to excuse it. I'm really big on consequences for actions. Absolutely. I'm really big on helping people set clear boundaries to have healthy relationships. And understanding doesn't mean you have to condone or agree with someone, not at all. But it does help significantly with your own internal dialogue when you have an understanding of why someone might have done something.
I'm curious to kind of maybe understand, as you said, in this example of you don't know what someone else's life situation is, therefore to be able to accurately predict whether you would have acted the same way or not. I know that, of course, you've worked with celebrities, with athletes, people who may seem like they have all the resources in the world, money, fame, opportunity, do you find that they therefore have been able to utilize those resources better in managing their inner world and outer world? Or do you feel like that's a false narrative that we tell ourselves when we're rich, or like when I'm rich or when I'm famous, I will have all my problems go away and I wouldn't be angry anymore? Like, is there a myth behind all of this?
It's an enormous myth. I remember early on in my career, I worked with someone who was worth over $1 billion. And he had the same anger and issues as everyone else. At the same time, I was also working with people who were living with dirt floors in their houses. And I noticed that whether I was talking to this person or that person, that, again, people have issues. That's why I started that tagline back in the 90s, because I thought, yeah, this is across the board. There is an illusion that somebody who is well known somehow has, but you know what? It's no different for anyone who might judge that and say, well, they have access, why not? It's no different than you and me and everyone listening or watching that has access to all the information in the world, but doesn't practice it. I mean, that's what it means to be human. Like, you have access to information, you meaning all of us have access to information that you do not act on. That's why so many people will say, well, of course I know that, or I know that. And that's where you get caught up in ego. And ego is not wrong or bad in and of itself, but ego can most definitely trip us up. When we get caught up in ego, that can trip us up for sure.
You've hinted at this twice now where, all this knowledge that you and I are currently discussing is technically freely available on the internet. But the difference is that people don't act on that knowledge. What have you learned in your practice that has helped people start acting on these knowledge?
So part of what the work is of a therapist or a counselor is to help shine a light that no matter how much you know something here, until you get it here, it's not going to benefit you. So being able to meet people where they are and help them take one step, even one step further, is a wonderful step in the right direction. Lao Tzu said many years ago, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And again, many people can rattle that line off. Many people can spit that line out. But many people are stuck in their lives when in reality, what they need to do is take that first step. And so again, it all comes down to what are we able to actually do with any kind of knowledge or wisdom.
So are you saying that for individuals who are maybe, for example, experiencing anger in a way that they feel is not healthy, and they're committed to wanting to change this, even if they don't have a therapist, because obviously not everybody have access to that, as long as they have someone that they could speak to that can hold them accountable to kind of who they say they want to be or how they want to act. And that person can kind of say, okay, what's the one step that you're going to take to become this person, and to force them to really think about what that one step is and then hold them accountable to taking that one step. And then hopefully once that becomes practice, then they can take the next step. Is that kind of the way you feel?
Absolutely. And I'm not, obviously not everyone has access to therapy. I kind of was just making a reference to that as for that being the job I've done for my career, that when you're in such a job like that. But the truth is, it can be a family member, a loved one, a friend. Enlightenment can come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. So it could be, if you can learn to really accept feedback as a gift, you could get feedback from someone who hates you and is petty and says the meanest things. But if you know how to listen for what they're shining light on, it can actually help you. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's anywhere, but here I do have an exercise for people if they don't have access to anyone else on the planet. If you have access to no one else on the planet and you can get in front of a mirror, and if you don't have a mirror, if you can go out in front of a puddle or a river and just look at your reflection and have a conversation with yourself. And, you can do this out loud. You don't have to do it out loud, obviously, but just look at yourself in the eyes and ask yourself, what is it that you want? What are you doing to get what you want? And if what you're doing to get what you want isn't working, then it's time to figure out what it is that you can do. But I will tell you that time and again, people come to me and they say, man, Doc, I don't even know where to begin. And I say, that's not true. You do know where to begin because you already are talking to me. So you realize that you needed to reach out and say something to someone. Now, what would the next step be? If I just disappeared from the universe and you were here by yourself, what would be the next thing? And then here's the key. No matter what that person says, no matter what you say next, that's a step. Maybe it's the direction you want to go. Maybe it's not. But a lot of times people are so self-critical that when they come up with an idea, they say, well, I can't do this. And they start telling it no before they even let it say it. If you get a silly idea out there, wonderful. That's an idea. Now play it out. That's the key. So ask yourself what you want, what you're doing to get what you want. If what you're doing is not working, then say, what do I think I need to do? And the next thing is, when you figure that out, this is what I need to do, just play that out. Because what a beautiful gift to be able to play out an idea in your mind before you actually have to experience it in life. So a lot of times people will come back from a disagreement or an argument and they'll say, oh, I should have said this. I thought about it now. And my dad has this wonderful book he wrote called This Is Not Your Practice Life. Wonderful. Fantastic idea. It's not your practice life. But the great thing is, if you think about events that might be coming up or situations that might cause you grief, if you can practice them before they happen, hey, I'm gonna interact with so-and-so today. This person has a tendency to push this button. Now, how might I react to it? Well, one way I could respond is from my ego. I could push to need to be right. Another way is to respond from my highest self and try to get an understanding, whatever it is. But my point is that we have the ability inside of us to figure things out. The truth is, the greatest therapists in the world only hold up a mirror so that you can see yourself.
I love that. And I love that you gave an example that meant that even if someone had not even a mirror, that you still didn't let them use that as an excuse. Go out to nature, go look at a reflected lake or something like that. That's awesome. I think that something that would be quite powerful to kind of understand is there an additional layer of consideration? Because a lot of the things that you've mentioned all sounds very reasonable. It, to me, feels like this is possible if someone is able to be reasoned or willing to be reasoned. But what about, as you said, those really scary convicted individuals that had, for example, committed murder? They could look at another human being and extinguish that person's life. So that to me sometimes feel like, is that person able to be reasoned? So what have you learned in the context of working with those really violent individuals that maybe are extra steps that need to be taken?
Well, so first and most importantly, what I've learned deeply and profoundly is that choices have consequences. So if a person chooses to lose control and do something and doesn't want to choose to attempt to reason themselves out of hurting someone else, there are consequences. I hear people all the time who've never set foot in a maximum security prison have opinions on whether or not there should be something like solitary confinement. But I actually work with the people who have done horrific things to everyone they've sailed them with. And I always tell people who are wondering about that, who are you going to put them with next? And risk that person's just torturous existence. Some people, their consequence is they cannot be around others because they will intentionally and willfully hurt them. So that's a reality. There are always consequences. And I think that's a really important lesson in life. Again, I want people to hear this, especially if they're struggling and maybe they're in an abusive relationship. Maybe they're in a relationship where they say, well, if I just understand them more, I advocate for you to have boundaries, for you to protect yourself. You should never feel threatened. You should never feel intimidated. And if you do feel like that, it really is okay to set boundaries and say, you know what, I want to get some support to move in a different direction. So again, by no means do I believe that understanding means condoning, but there are consequences to actions. And whether people do it to themselves or, as you said, they do it to someone else, we have a responsibility in society to give the world our best effort.
Hey, since you kind of went there, let's just assume that some of our listeners are in a domestic violent relationship, and they deeply love this individual and want to try and help the individual work towards taking steps so that they can better manage their emotions and their anger. So how do you communicate with that person in a way that doesn't trigger them to be more angry or make the situation more aggressive? How does one have those conversations in a safe way that sets boundaries?
So if someone out there listening doesn't feel safe to have a conversation because if they say the wrong thing that they're in trouble, I would really strongly encourage you with love to reach out and talk to somebody who's away from that relationship to get some insight to see if it's really a safe place or relationship for you to be. And that's first and foremost. If we're talking about, so there's a continuum of violence. And again, if somebody's in danger, to me, that's pressing. And I really hope that you can, it's not easy at all, especially when you love somebody so much, but definitely you are worth never feeling threatened or intimidated in a relationship. But let's say that it's not quite that far. And let's say that it's just, it's becoming the start of needing to walk on eggshells. I really believe, and that's what my book, Walking Through Anger, is all about how do you talk in a really intensely emotional situation without triggering people's fight or flight response. And one way to do it is first of all, I have a 3-step: listen, validate, explore options. So you might listen when you want to be heard. If you start by listening and then validate that person's perspective, genuinely validate it, but then you start to explore some options. For example, I might say to somebody, I don't know if you're aware of this, and I don't think that this is your intention. I have no idea. But I almost feel as if I have to walk on eggshells at times with you, and that's not comfortable for me. And I want to be able to say that and then see what that kind of reaction is. Because if you can't even say that to a person, then again, if you're in a spot where you can't even express that you might feel like you have to be on eggshells, and you'll notice how I couch that in a soft word, like I might feel like I have to walk, because if I say it that way and that still elicits defensiveness, well, that's a big signal. But I would encourage people strongly to be able to feel safe enough to say it. And sometimes the easiest way to say it in a tough moment is to say, part of me. Part of me almost feels like I have to walk on eggshells at times. I mean, part of me doesn't, but that's an easier way if you're talking about a tense situation to get around the person's ego, because ultimately you want to be heard.
I love that. And I think it again brings back one of the tips that you shared before, which is watching the language. We talked about, not using extreme language in the individual who's going through anger issues, but actually you yourself as the person having a relationship with someone like that also needs to be mindful that you don't speak in a way that pushes their fight or flight response by making it very extreme as well. Like, you always make me feel unsafe. And immediately that is an untruth, and that person's going to fight back with like, that's not true.
I'm so thankful that you just phrased it that way, because that's what I really believe is helpful for people to hear. If you come at somebody by saying you always do this, if they didn't do it one time 20 years ago, that's what they're going to zero in on. And so instead of that, now you're missing it. So accurate language, oh my goodness, it makes a world of difference.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is so powerful is that oxymoron where you might feel like you're not being heard, but I've learned myself that when I feel like that, the first place to start is actually giving space to the other individual to be listened to. Because once that other individual feels heard themselves, they will give space to hear you. And it's not the immediate reaction one goes like, I'm not feeling heard. I need to keep telling my point again and again and again until they hear me. And actually, if you take a step back and say, hey, this is a situation that's not working for me. How do you see it? So like give them the floor first. Then once they've said their piece, then they can take the time to listen to you, which is, it's counterintuitive.
That's it. Because what happens is you hit the nail on the head. The ego wants to be right. And so it's about, I need to tell you I'm right, you're wrong. And when it's about ego, it's not going to be about peace. I always say you can be right or you can be happy. But it's rarely is it both. It's not about being right. It's about really being understood. It's about feeling safe. Like you have a partner who you're committed to them, they're committed to you, and you feel safe and have trust and you can grow together. And growing together means being able to learn how to communicate through difficult moments. And that's really well worth any new couple taking time to learn. We're always going to have disagreements. We're human beings. But can we disagree with the utmost respect for one another?
And obviously you mentioned it in the context of a couple, but really these things that we're talking about can be relevant to anyone, your best friend, your boss, your colleague, your parents. So this is like very relevant life skill, really, communication skills. Cristian, we talk a lot about this in the context of, adults that have developed executive functions in their brain. Is the stuff that you talked about relevant in the context of kids, say like under 12, when sometimes you see kids get really angry and have outbursts, and part of it is it's just childhood development and it's just normal. They have to go through that. But is there, I'm not sure if you have experience commenting in the context of children with anger issues.
Most definitely. So one of the things that we want to do is give our children credit that they can understand concepts. I always feel like it's my job to break it down so that a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old can understand it. So one thing that I know that we did with our daughter when she was real young is I taught her about the hypothalamus. This is going to sound fancy, but I'll break it down really simply in a minute. But the hypothalamus is the center of our hunger, thirst, body temperature, fatigue. And the hypothalamus is located in the middle of the limbic system. So if you've ever been in an argument with your loved one because one or both of you was overly hungry or one or both of you was overly tired, it's the hypothalamus.
I definitely get hangry, so.
Yes, and so, yes, it makes sense because that hypothalamus in the middle limbic system. So it makes sense why we get emotional when we feel that way. But I just taught that to our daughter when she was very young. And I said, it's okay to say, I'm really hungry right now. And when we're hungry, we tend to feel agitated and irritable. And sometimes we think, and if we don't just say we're hungry, we might start making up a story. So I don't think children are too young to teach them that their mind wants to match their body. So if their body feels really hungry or tired and it feels agitated and irritable, then they're going to want to make up a story. Well, it must be you. It must be this or this friend. Instead, to become mindful that I think I'm a little hungry right now. And it's really funny. Our daughter's 19. When she was 8 years old, we made a video for school that I ended up putting on my YouTube channel, Neuroscience with an 8-year-old. But in that video, Out of the Mouths of Babes, it was like at the end of the video, and she said, Daddy, I'm really in my hypothalamus right now. I'm getting really tired. And it was just, you couldn't have planned it. It was phenomenal. But that was an example of, it was a running joke. Now, because of my profession, I taught her the words hypothalamus and taught her parts of the brain. But even if you don't want to use that fancy language, you can teach children sometimes when we're really hungry, it's okay to say, I'm really hungry. Because when I get really hungry, I feel mad, I feel angry. When I'm really tired, I can feel really angry. If I'm really hot, I can feel really angry. And it's okay to learn to say, I'm really angry, or I'm really hungry right now, or I'm really tired. And I think with children, one of the biggest challenges so many children have is that they have literal physiological things happening, hunger, thirst, body temperature, fatigue, And yet parents the moment they get agitated, then the parents react in an agitated way back to them, like cartoon world, you shouldn't be acting like that. Whereas when our daughter would act like that, I would stop and say, what's going on, honey? What do you think's happening? And I get down on a knee, because again, 6 feet, 260 something, I don't want to be standing over top of a little child, because that's a very intimidating position. So I drop down on a knee, hey honey, what's going on? And we'd talk it out. And really, you can talk it out. I developed the 4 C's of parenting before that we were parents: choices, consequences, consistency, and compassion. But I knew because I worked in so much violence that I never wanted to have violence in our household. I wanted our home to be a place of peace. So I quite literally never yelled at or even spanked our daughter. But she listened on a dime, because we were just very consistent. Like if you choose to whine, there'll be a consequence. Oh, but I don't want to. Boom, now there's a consequence. And so she learned her choices have consequences. And there is a way to learn that and teach that to kids. I definitely have some free videos on YouTube that can be helpful, centered on parenting. And I even have a book called Zen Parent, Zen Child, which is what the saying is. If you want your children to be Zen, you've got to live it by example.
I love it. Oh, so many gems right there. And I also just want to call out the fact that you said these physiological things where you're tired, you're hungry. These aren't just for children. They're very much adults are also in that bucket, where if you find yourself lashing out, just really ask yourself, where are you at? Like, have you had lunch today? Or have you been so busy with your back-to-back meetings that you haven't taken a 30-minute lunch break? And so the poor next person who's having a meeting with you is getting the full hanger, basically. So
yes, listen, my wife and I have been married for 24 years. And we will say, if I felt agitated, I would say, listen, you look like a piece of pizza to me right now. So until I get something to eat, it's not worth trying to have a serious conversation, because all I see is my hunger and my agitation. I think one of the parts of yield theory I'm really proud to share with the world is this. I love cognitive behavioral therapy. I love it. It influenced me. It's heavily intertwined in my work. But the difference between cognitive behavioral therapy and yield theory is this. In cognitive behavioral therapy, they say that your thoughts determine your emotions. And in yield theory, we say your thoughts influence your emotions, but your mind always wants to match your body. So that it's an important distinction. And here's why. If we down 3 energy drinks right now, you and me, our heart's going to start to race and our body's going to mimic physiological anxiety. Well, that's right. Yeah. And then our mind will race to make up a story to make sense out of that. So we'll say, right. I forgot to send that email, or, well, did I pay that bill, or whatever it is. And our brain literally through neural patterns wants to find the story that makes the most sense out of the body. But when you learn mindfulness, you're able to develop the skill of saying, okay, in this moment, I'm really agitated. I'm really irritable right now. Oh, let me check. I'm really hungry. And now we don't have to create and add to some giant narrative. And instead, we can be accurate with our language. We can set aside our cartoon world and align our expectations with the real world. And I think that's a wonderful way to maintain inner control.
Yeah, look, I think physiological needs is one thing. But of course, as you mentioned as well, it's about this gap between your expectation and reality. So if I'm going to be super facetious, then should I just say, just have no expectations? If you have no expectations in life, you cannot be disappointed. Is that the way you would approach it, or how would you?
No, and I'm glad you said that. I'm really grateful you shined a light on that, because that's not it. Because there's a difference between expecting everything to be terrible and having no expectations, and in the reality, knowing that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So it's okay to align your expectations with reality. For example, let's go back to the traffic example. When you leave your house, if you go to work every day and you always you run into traffic 99 times out of 100, then it's okay to expect that you're going to run into traffic. You don't have to expect, if it's a Saturday and there's not normally traffic, it'd be perfectly healthy to say, hey, I can save time going into the city because You don't expect there to be a lot of traffic. But when it does occur, or if an accident happened, instead of saying, oh, I can't take this, be accurate. You know what? This traffic is taking longer than I would like. This is what I mean by, so I created this technique called sans adjectives. It's just a fancy way of saying, take away all the adjectives. And I do this technique with people where I'll say, tell me about the latest thing that really angered you. And then I let them really get into it. Well, this stupid person did this, and I can't believe they did blah, 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 blah. And then I'll say, now let's take away all the adjectives. This car is driving slower than I'd like it to be going. I mean, wow, what a difference between, this person's rude, they're no, this car is going slower than I want it to be going. And the more accurate your language, the more you're able to handle life's obstacles. But yeah, it's not about having no expectations. It's about aligning your expectations with reality and recognizing past behaviors the best.
I'm going to ask a different way to think about this. So what you're saying is that don't have no expectation, have expectation that is couched in reality of past experiences that you've experienced. But a large part of why we get disappointed is because we compare ourselves to the lives of others that we often see on social media. We see this other person having this perfect life where they get to go out to eat every day and have happy children that never gets upset and throw their toys and have the perfect partner that adores them and opens their car doors. We set our expectations in parts because we see other people's reality. Well, obviously we know that that's not reality, but that's what's forming our expectation. How do you think about managing expectation and preventing, unhealthy comparisons in that context?
Well, first of all, one way to align your expectations with reality in social media is this. Anybody who's really peaceful and enjoying life doesn't have the need to stop and show other people. So the only reason why people are posting this or that is because they're looking for external validation. If you're perfectly content with yourself and your life and what you're doing, you have no need to say, I need to show everybody how I'm living perfectly or this or that. There is a cultural piece of people wanting to be in a society of social media, and I get that. And there's nothing wrong with anything in balance. But if you'll notice someone really making an emphasis to show this perfect life, please know that is not reality. It's just not. And again, I've worked with celebrities on television. I work with some of the best athletes in the world, some really very extraordinarily famous individuals. And again, I still stick to my tagline, two kinds of people with issues and dead people. We all have issues. One of the ways I try to empower people who are struggling with self-esteem issues is to understand that the people who need to say the loudest how great they are, how wonderful everything is, those are the ones who inside feel awful. They feel awful. So if you recognize that, the louder someone brags, the worse they feel on the inside, then instead of feeling envious, you'll probably feel sorry that they're struggling in that way. And again, you can start to see yourself in a more accurate vision because it's not everybody's. That social media is a bunch of everybody's best moments. Hey, we're together. Let's take a picture. Hey, we're smiling. You might have been arguing the whole night long, but when everybody gets together for the photo, you're smiling. And so I think it's important to teach young people as they're looking at it. That's what they're looking at. The person who's constantly posting is doing it for external validation.
So obviously we've talked about helping someone manage expressing emotions in a healthier way. And the opposite is they're not expressing emotions at all. Like, for example, maybe their parent passed away and it looks like they have not reacted to the situation at all, as if they haven't expressed or processed the situation and therefore have no emotional response from it. Is there something different to consider in that context when thinking about regulating emotions?
Most definitely. So some people's response to trauma is to move forward and not think about it because it can overwhelm them so much. And others in society can say they not the norm, so therefore you must not be caring. You must not be this. Look, before 9/11, there was a lot of, they implemented this, what's called critical incident stress debriefing. Now, I understand that has morphed and changed and adapted through the years, and that's wonderful. But at the time, it was a pretty rigid process whereby they would make people they get everybody together, they had to talk about the crisis. What they found was a slew of research showed that it was actually inducing post-traumatic stress disorder in certain people. And the reason why is this. For many people, it's really healthy and effective to talk about whatever's going on. But for some people, neurologically, what's best for them is to move on and leave it in the past. That's how their brains work. And so forcing them to do something that might work for you or someone else can really be a harmful act. So know that. One, that's really important to understand. Some people do respond differently, but maybe the question leans more toward those who are struggling internally and they're not giving themselves a chance to process it. And that happens a lot with men, because men have this societal norm that it's not okay to talk about feeling hurt, that it's not okay to be perceived as weak in any way. And so one of the things I do, I work with some top military people and some of the most incredibly tough human beings on the planet. But what I say to them is this: no matter how strong you are, you still have a 3-pound brain. And as much as when you're hurt, that hurt impacts you. And it's okay to acknowledge that. So for people who are struggling internally, quietly, I guess what I would want them to feel is it is okay to acknowledge your hurt. And you're not alone in that. I can promise you that you are not alone. You know, the research shows that there are probably anywhere between 4 and 7 primary emotions. So imagine, statistically speaking, if there are more than 8 billion people on the planet and only a handful of primary emotions, that means in every given moment, there are at least millions of other people who feel exactly how you feel. So you're never as alone as you might think.
That's awesome. You know, we obviously covered a lot of heavy topics, and as we hinted before, that if you're struggling for whatever situation you're in, please don't struggle alone. There is professional help out there, and Clearhead, if your employer uses us as your EAP provider, you can get free therapy through us. So really want to encourage people to seek extra help, and that it's, you know, wherever you are in the spectrum, whether you're the victim or the person going through anger management. Cristian, we love to close out our sessions with one question, which is, what is your one wellbeing practice that you have?
I would say one of the most pragmatic well-being practices that I do, and what I share with others that I think can really help, is that every emotional experience has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the more you recognize this, no matter how intense emotions ever come, you recognize they'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our emotions come and go, but our actions can't be undone. Our words can't be unsaid. And I think the more we recognize that, it's a really helpful practice. But in truth, I practice all the stuff that we're talking about. Like I said, I'm human as much as everybody else. So I have all the spectrum of emotions and emotional experiences. But what I really do believe in is accurate language. And I've practiced it for so many years, for decades, of practicing accurate language. You know what? This didn't go the way I would have liked it to, but it's not the end of the world and I can handle it. I think the more people practice that, it's a powerful phrase, and it's a great practice. But again, I guess I'd close on, no matter what you know here, if you don't practice it, it doesn't make a difference. So give yourself the courage to practice what you know.
Amazing. You know, through this talk, I had so many quotes come to me, and I'm going to end with these 2 quotes that I think you'll really like. One I've heard recently is, your trauma or issues is not your fault, but they are your responsibility. And the other one that I thought about was, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else, but you're the one that gets burned. And so I think that those 2 things really summarize the fact that this starts with self-work. Take that first step, ask for help if you need it. And if you're a party to experiencing anger, then take the courage in a safe way to let that individual know, because that's usually the first step that that individual needs to be self-aware about the situation.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.